Hello viewers, today I'm working on a 2010 Toyota Corolla with the 1.8 liter 2ZR FE engine, and we are going to be replacing the spark plugs. Welcome back to the Moose Mobile Auto Repair channel. And so today we are going to be replacing the spark plugs on this Corolla. This Corolla has roughly 182,000 kilometers. So as per the customer's request, they want to replace the spark plugs again. Now this vehicle has had probably 2 or 3 spark plugs changed in the past, because the customer they like to take care of this vehicle, so we are going to be replacing them today. Now these particular spark plugs that I'm using are the NGK Ruthenium spark plugs. So these spark plugs have a better ignitability, and so it creates a better spark. This is more of like a high performance spark plug versus the conventional Denso long life Iridium spark plugs, which were originally equipped with this engine from the factory. Usually when you remove the factory spark plugs, you will know that they are the original spark plugs. When you see something at the bottom on the ground terminal over here, there will be like a plus a symbol. So if you see like a dot or a plus symbol, that's going to signify that these spark plugs are the factory spark plugs. So I'll give you guys a better view because the camera was not focusing. If you look closely, you can see the plus symbol on this spark plug. Now earlier I did spark plugs replacement on a 2017 Toyota Corolla. It's relatively the same exact procedure as this one, but I'm going to film this one anyways. So this one, it has the plus symbol on the ground terminal. So if you see a plus or a dot, that's going to signify that the spark plug is the original spark plug that came from the factory. So these are the Denso spark plugs, SC16HR11. I don't know if these spark plugs are also compatible with this engine. This one is a 2010, and this one came out of a 2017. So the ones we are going to be replacing it with are the NGK spark plugs. These are the Ruthenium spark plugs. So the part number is LKAR7AHX-S if you want to get the same ones. So these ones are just a little bit more expensive than the factory spark plugs. It's not that much more expensive, but probably like $2 or $3 more. So roughly you can probably find these between maybe like 14 or 15 to $20 Canadian at the time of this video. So it's going to vary depending on in which country and area that you live in. So we are going to get started. We are going to remove the engine cover. You want to lift up at one corner at a time. You don't want to lift up at the same time, because it's possible that you can break the plastic cover, and you can see it's already broken over here. You can see the piece is broken, but we are just going to leave that. So you need to be careful, otherwise you're going to crack the engine cover. So now when you remove the cover, you'll have access to the four ignition coils and spark plugs. So you will need to remove the connectors for each one. So usually you can push on the tab and to pull it out if you're able to get it out. If not, you can push on this and use a thin screwdriver to push gently up on the tab and just enough so that you're able to pull it out. We'll do the same for this one as well. And now we're going to proceed to remove the rest, the last two. You just want to be extremely careful to not break those tabs. So just be careful. I know on some of the Toyota engines, these are known to break because of the heat. And some guys don't bother replacing the connector. They just put it in. They either put a piece of tape to hold it in place or a zip tie around there. So there's not that much you can do except to end up replacing the connector itself. You will need to remove the wires out individually and get a new connector either from the dealership or somewhere else and install a new one in order to fix those problems. So but it's not the end of the world if these break. You can still use them, but you have to make sure that you have something that's securing it inside. You want to make sure it has a good contact inside the ignition coil pins. So now there are four 10 millimeter bolts that you need to take out. I'm just using a Milwaukee electronic ratchet. So you can use a standard ratchet with a socket, or you can even use a wrench to remove these ignition coil bolts. This one is a bit hard to access, so I may have to switch over with a small ratchet of some sort, probably a 1/4 inch ratchet. Probably use something like this because I'm not able to get in there. You do not need to remove the cowl on this model, so you should be okay. So we're going to remove the bolt and remove all four coils. So we just need to to carefully to wiggle and to pull the coil out. I think this vehicle has some aftermarket ignition coils installed on this, I believe. So we're going to set that aside. Make sure that you are careful with these ignition coils because if you drop them on the floor, it states in service information to replace it. So these coils are very sensitive. So it says if it's dropped, they are recommending that you replace them. So these ones, they have three aftermarket coils and one original coil. There's been some issues with this vehicle in the past, but they have been fixed. So anyhow, there's the original Denso part number. If you want to get yourselves the ignition coil, part number 90919-0 2252. Just a word of advice about ignition coils. I recommend to just get the original Denso coils. Do not use aftermarket coils, because some aftermarket coils I've had too many problems with them. They probably go for like a year or something, and then they will have a dead misfire of some sort. And then you have to replace the coil again. These coils don't last very long. I've seen these coils go for anywhere from like a year of regular driving up to maybe like 3 or 4 years maximum. So you're probably best just to get the original coils from the dealership, just to be on the safe side. So we're going to start the removal process of the spark plugs. I forgot to mention that to make sure that you are working on a cold engine, do not work on a very warm or hot engine. Either wait a couple hours or so, or wait until the next day, like in the morning, so that you don't do any damage, because these cylinder heads are made out of aluminum, and so it's very easy to damage the threads. So make sure you wait till the engine has cooled down before you start replacing the spark plugs. So I'm just using a 3/8 drive ratchet with a long extension, and I'm using a 14 millimeter spark plug socket, 12 point. This one also works for these Toyotas. This particular one that I got back in the day, I used to use them for the BMWs and the Mini Coopers. And so it still works well on these Toyotas. I'm using this because this has a thin walled socket, so it's easy to get in and out, because the other spark plug sockets I've used, they get stuck after I install the new spark plugs, and then I have to use a needle nose pliers to get them out. So I like to use this one. The part number AST SP1412. I believe this is by a company called Macker. So you might be able to get this off of Amazon if it's available. Also, make sure that when you are removing and installing spark plugs, to keep an eye on the rubber boot in here that holds the spark plugs, because with use, the rubber boot gets loose, and sometimes they come out and they will get stuck on top of the spark plug. So just make sure you're always making sure that the rubber boot in here is always inside, because there are sometimes they can get stuck inside the spark plug hole. So we're going to proceed to remove the spark plug now. You may need to lift up on the cowl area. If for any reason you're having a hard time in trying to remove the spark plugs, you can spray a little bit of the penetrating oil or WD-40 or Crown stuff or something, and it will make it easier to remove the spark plugs. I know that sometimes they're a little bit like a slight like rust buildup inside on the threads. So particularly that if you feel that the spark plugs are very hard to reinstall, and what I usually do is I spray a tiny bit of penetrating oil inside to lubricate the threads, and it'll make it easier to install, either to remove or install the spark plugs. So it will not do any harm. After you're done, it will go into the combustion chamber and outside the tailpipe. It won't do any damage. You just need to spray a tiny amount. So usually if you spray anything in the spark plug holes, you'll see a little bit of smoke outside the tailpipe after engine startup, but it's not anything to be worried about. So we're going to take the spark plugs out. We're on the number 1 cylinder. This is the number 1. These ones also had the NGK Ruthenium spark plugs installed on these. Just regular wear and tear on the insulator and stuff. So it hasn't, I don't think it's been that many kilometers since, probably like 40 or 50,000 kilometers. I will admit it's a little bit early to replace these, because these ones often last a very long time. Now this spark plug, you can see there's a little bit of like a brown stain here. That's not too bad. There are some instances that some people may mistake this as a combustion leakage from the combustion chamber, but sometimes this can just be something called a Corona stain. So I will put the information on the screen for you guys to read about that. It's just a regular from the wear and tear of the spark plugs. So we are going to continue to remove the rest of the spark plugs. Whoop. I just I lifted up on the cowl. This is a 2-piece cowl, so you can do that if you want, just to lift up here. It will not do any damage. You're perfectly fine. So that was just by accident. So we're gonna continue to remove the rest of the spark plugs now. It's perfectly safe to use this for loosening up the spark plugs. It won't do any harm. This is the number 2. On these spark plugs, they don't have anything on the ground terminal. As I said earlier, you will see a plus symbol. Once again, if you have the factory spark plugs, I'm just showing this for one last time. So you'll see like a plus or a dot, a symbol, if you have the factory spark plugs. I'm just making sure that the boot is still in there. And usually you'll see it on top of the spark plug if it got caught onto it. So we're gonna do the next one. Also, you can also have a look inside the spark plug hole with the flashlight, with a borescope camera if you have one, to see if there's any oil leakage from the spark plug tubes. So usually the spark plug tubes come with the valve cover gasket. So if for any reason that the spark plugs are covered in oil, it would mean that the spark plug tubes are leaking, and so you would need to replace the whole valve cover gasket in order to fix that. So I'm just going to get this out. There's a little bit slight resistance than normal, because the anti-seize has been installed on these plugs. So usually when you install spark plugs, you should reduce the torque by about 20 to 30%, because the anti-seize is a lubricating property. So you will over torque the spark plugs if you don't reduce the torque spec by about 20 to 30%. The torque spec on this is like 15 foot-pounds. So you reduce by 20-30%. So it'll be around like 11, 12, or 13 foot-pounds roughly. You can do that. That's what it's been stated, but I have never done that. I don't reduce the torque spec. I torque it to spec. If it's 15, I put 15. I just put a very light coat of anti-seize when you install the plugs. So anyhow, I will get down to that in detail after. So this is the third one. We're going to do the next one now. To lift up on the cable when you are removing this. So that's the number 4. So and what I like to do if I feel that the spark plugs had a little bit of resistance, I use penetrating oil. I'll just spray a tiny amount in each of the spark plug holes, and it's going to help to install the spark plugs. It's going to help to lubricate the threads, so it'll make it easier to install the spark plugs. So we are going to have a look at the old spark plug just to check the spark plug gap on the old one, and roughly 40 thousandths of an inch. I think that's what the specifications are normally. I will put it on the screen for you guys to see for the spark plug gap. I'm using both a ramp style spark plug checker, and I also have a wire style spark plug checker. This is 40 thousandths here. It should go in somewhat easy. This is 35 thousandths. Doesn't go in too easy on the 40. Actually it's going in now on the 40 thousandths, and the 45 thousandths I'm not able to get in there. Now, just a word of caution: I usually do not recommend to check the gap on the new spark plugs. The reason being for that is because that they have a coating on the top here, and also they also have the fine electrode. I think it's like a piece or a wire. The electrode tip, you can see a piece that sticks out from there. So I don't know if you can see that on camera. So the issue with that is that when you use a ramp style or even a wire style spark plug checker, it's possible that when you are trying to check the gap, you will damage the coating on the spark plug. And so even if you're careful, or if you're not careful, it's possible to break that coating. And once you break that coating, then the spark plug is garbage. You will have to get a new one. So typically, I used to check the spark plug gaps years ago. I haven't had any problems in trying to check the gaps, but these days I just like to do a quick visual inspection. You can just try to eyeball it and do a comparison with the old plug, and typically that the spark plug gap will naturally increase with age. So because of all of the heat, so the expansion, so it's going to expand the area between the ground electrode and the electrode tip. So it's going to increase that gap. In these modern day spark plugs, these days the gap hardly ever changes. So even at 100,000 kilometers, the gap will remain relatively the same. So this spark plug here has been in for 40 or 50,000 kilometers. It didn't need to be changed, but the customer wants to change it anyways. So this spark plug gap is basically almost the same thing as this one. This is brand new. So it's going to take a very, very long time for that gap to increase. So anyhow, I just like to do a visual on the gap. I try to not check it, because if I try to check it, it will get stuck inside and it's possible to damage the coating. So I just do a visual inspection, and you should be fine. I haven't had problems in all of these years, whether I check the gaps or not. So you are not supposed to adjust the gap on modern day spark plugs. So you should not adjust the gap under any circumstances. If for any reason that the gap is off, then you need to go and get yourself a new spark plug. The service procedures, they recommend that you do not adjust the gap. If you have to adjust the gap, then you go and you get yourself a new spark plug or a new set of spark plugs. So the spark plugs I have here, they come in a box uh, like this. It says ultra high ignitability spark plugs. So just be very careful to not drop the spark plugs, because if you drop the spark plugs, then those are no longer good. So you would have to get a new one. So these parts are very fragile. So I'm going to lubricate this with some anti-seize. I'm using the silver stuff. You can also use the copper stuff if you want. The modern day spark plugs today have like a nickel and or a zinc coating on the threads. Manufacturers of the spark plugs have stated that you don't need to put anti-seize because it has a coating on it, but that coating is not enough sometimes, depending on the driving conditions of the vehicle. So usually I like to put anti-seize to prevent any problems in the future, because the last thing that I want is that the spark plugs to be seized inside the cylinder head the next time I want to take them out. So I recommend to add a little bit of anti-seize onto the spark plugs. So we're just going to put a tiny amount. You don't need to put too much. I just put a tiny amount, and I just use like my pinky finger to spread all around here, and then that's it. I don't like to use all that much. So I put some on the top threads, and when you install it, the anti-seize will spread all across the threads and work its way down. It's like this one here. The anti-seize, it worked its way down, so you just need to put some on the top threads, and when you install the spark plug, it will cover up the rest of the threads. So we're going to install the first one now. Always tighten it by hand first. Usually on what I like to do, I like to thread the spark plugs all the way by hand, just to make sure that it's all the way in there, because I don't want to have any problems. So I want to make sure that it's threaded by hand all the way. And then later we are going to We are going to hand tighten them, and then we are going to torque it to spec afterwards. I'm going to do the number 2 spark plug. I forgot to mention that there's a sealing washer on these spark plugs. So the reason why I recommend to torque the spark plugs to the torque specifications is so that these sealing washers, they get crushed. They are like a crush washer. So when you tighten it down, it needs to seal 100% against the combustion chamber. So you want to make sure it's sealing 100% so that combustion gases do not escape from here. Otherwise, you will have problems. Now, a lot of times that if you just tighten them down snug, you will be able to get away with it in a majority of cases. But in some rare cases, you might have some problems. So I've never had problems tightening it down snug. No, there are some rules in which you can tighten it down until it contacts the cylinder head, and then usually like a quarter or half a turn or something. I will put the information on the screen if you don't have a torque wrench on how to properly torque down the spark plugs. But if you have a torque wrench, it's recommended that you torque the spark plugs to spec if you have access to those spark plugs. Now, I can understand on some engines the access is very difficult to fit a torque wrench inside. So sometimes you tighten it down snug and then you should be okay. I'm going to install that one. I'm just doing it by hand first, and then we're going to tighten it down with a ratchet afterwards. So this is the number 2. You want to make sure that you don't drop the spark plugs in here. I've seen guys, they drop the spark plug slightly in there. That's not good, because it's possible that you can disturb and change the gap on the spark plug. So you don't want to do that. If your socket is worn out and it won't hold the spark plug in place, you can like use a magnet or something to get it inside. Just use the correct tool to get the spark plug in. So that's that. We're going to do the number 3 now. One last thing I forgot to mention to you guys is to make sure that you are having a look at the length of the spark plug. Make sure that the length is exactly the same, because I've had spark plugs where the length were slightly longer. So we need to watch out, because it will still fit inside the engine. If you don't see that and you put the spark plug in, it's possible that you can damage the engine, because the piston is, when the piston goes up, it's going to hit the spark plug. So make sure that the spark plug is the same size as the ones that came out of the engine. Just a light coat of anti-seize. You don't want to put too much. You don't want to overdo it. So we're going to thread this one by hand, just like the others. Same process. This is an easy peasy one to do for these engines. The access is there. So you can get this done in like an hour or less time. So I'm just going to thread this in all the way. Sometimes you can get it on the first few threads and you're fine, but I like to get it in all the way down, because gives me a better confidence, so that I don't damage anything. So that's in now. We're gonna get this out. And then the last one. So now I'm using my regular conventional ratchet, the small one, so I can get the proper feel. So usually once it contacts the cylinder head, you can just do, it's like usually a quarter or half a turn or something. I'll put the instructions for you guys. I just do it by feel, and then usually you're good after that. There will be a lot of times where you will think that it's tight, but it's not tight enough, or it's either too loose or too tight. So you have to make sure you're doing it right. So I'm gonna do the next one, and I'm going to get the torque wrench after that. I don't usually follow the that kind of method. I just do it by feel. I don't do the quarter or half a turn thing. I go by feel until it's tight. So it's good. And once again, if you don't have a torque wrench, it won't be the end of the world. You can get them on snug, and then you should be okay. It's not that big of a deal. But if you have a torque wrench and then use it, it's best to use it, because anything on the engine, usually it's best to torque it. And we're going to do this one after. And then that's it. I'm going to go and get my fancy electronic torque wrench just for the sake of this video. So I'm going to bring it, and then I'll be back. So I have my Mac Tools 3/8 digital torque wrench. This is a fancy one. It's very expensive. I paid roughly $800 for this. It's not cheap. So this is for guys who work on vehicles on a regular basis and doing like usually engine work and stuff and and things like that. So I set it to 15. Torque spec is 15 for this. So we're going to torque it now. I I recommend to test the torque wrenches first, regardless of what torque wrench you have. So I'd probably try to test it like on some bolt or something, just to make sure that the torque wrench is functioning properly, because you don't want to take any chances. We're going to start to torque this. At the 15. I take this out so it's all torqued to spec. As you can see here, I was quite accurate with the memory torque or the hand torque. So I was pretty close or exactly the same because I did not have to tighten it any further. So now we're going to install the ignition coils back. Just make sure you try to put the coils back exactly in the same ones in which they came out. So I like to use a little bit of dielectric grease. I'm using the Super Lube stuff. So I'm going to put a tiny amount of the dielectric grease. And then we're going to install those back. I like to put a little bit on the boot and a little bit on the electrical contact area. You don't need to put too much. Just make sure you don't get any like debris inside. And then the last one. Make sure that before you install the coils, I forgot to mention that the rubber piece is still here because there are sometimes they like to fall off. Now we're going to install the bolts. I like to put dielectric grease on the bolts as well, a tiny amount. The whole purpose of doing this is mainly because so they don't seize up or get stuck in the future, because then you'll have problems later on. So that's why it's good to do this, especially if you're keeping a vehicle for a very long time. You don't want to end up having any problems. So we're just going to tighten the bolts snug after. I believe these bolts are, the torque spec are 7 foot-pounds. I'm just going to run it through with our electric ratchet, and that should be good. And we're going to install the connectors last. Just want to get the bolts in. And this one I have to do by hand because I cannot reach. You can use like a U joint or something, but I'm just going to tighten it by hand, and then that's it. These don't need to be on too tight. I'm just going to make sure that they are tight, just verifying that they are not loose, just making sure everything is tight, and then reconnect the connectors. You should be able to hear the audible click for each one. Make sure you tug and pull gently on the connector just to make sure it's in. And then you should be all good to go. And we're going to reinstall the engine cover and then start the vehicle and see on how she sounds. So we are going to start the engine up. So she's running well now. Everything sounds good. So we're just gonna reinstall the engine cover and then and take this vehicle for a road test. So now we're going to reinstall the engine cover. And then we are going to go for a road test afterwards. So that's it now. The vehicle is running pretty well. I'm just gonna go for a road test and confirm the repair, and then that's it. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please don't forget to give it a like, and please consider subscribing to my channel if you're not already a subscriber, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good day and take care.